Thank you. This is work that I've done with a couple of my students, Mucun and Imran, and my collaborators, Hoda and Daniel. And so I want to start by talking a little bit about why we care about this problem. And since our talks are short here, I'm going to talk mostly about why we care and the high-level takeaways. All the details are in the paper. So a corner of my Twitter feed is people who are in the intersectional feminist sci-fi literary community. And they were very excited this year when N.K. Jemisin won the Hugo Award for Best Novel for, I believe, the third year in a row. Because many people in this community are very involved and invested in trying to promote diversity and representation among book authors, so that we have more stories to read by a diverse selection of voices, and that more groups of people and more voices are represented in the content we have to consume. And there are a lot of efforts in this front. This chart is from Canadian Women in the Literary Arts, and each year they undertake a count where they look at books that are being reviewed, and they look at the gender of the authors that are being reviewed, and they see how are different author genders represented among books being reviewed, and they also break that down by reviewer gender to collect data on what's happening with author representation in Canadian literature. So the question that has captured my attention for some time now is to understand how recommender systems interact with these efforts. So if we have these social efforts to get more women, more people of color, more indigenous people, more members of the LGBTQ community involved in writing and producing books and getting their books published, what happens when these new authors and their new books hit the recommender system? So they're going to go up on Goodreads, they're going to go on Amazon, they're going to go on Barnes & Noble, and the recommender system is going to be one of the mediating factors that affects how they get to their audience. And there's a few different things that the recommender could do. The recommender could help them find their audience and connect them with that group of readers that is going to buy their book, that is going to become a fan, that's going to clamor for the next one, that's going to help them get their next book contract and get established in their author career. It could just be a thing that they have to deal with like any other thing that's not actively helping them, but it's not actively harming them either. It's just a conduit. It could be a hurdle. It could be that they get the book published, but then it doesn't show up in the recommendations. And so they can't find their audience. The book doesn't do well. They don't get their next book contract. And so our goal in this line of work that this paper is just the beginning of is to try to understand for different settings, for different domains, for different recommendation algorithms and algorithm families, which of these three paths does the recommender take, and to what extent? So to do that, for this immediate work, we have 4 research questions. We first look at the distribution of author gender in the book inventory. We then look at, when we go from the book inventory to the user's ratings, what does that distribution look like? We go from ratings to recommendations. What does that distribution look like? And then finally, we build the personalized link. How does the distribution in an individual user's recommendations relate to the distribution in their user profile? To position this more broadly in the context of algorithmic fairness and recommender fairness, we're looking mostly at provider fairness here. We're looking at content providers, authors, and how the system treats them, although we're taking a user perspective, so fitting it into provider fairness is a little weird. We're also looking at calibrated fairness. So Justin, in presenting the paper yesterday on calibrated recommendations, talked about their applications to fairness, and that's really what we're looking at. How does the balance of the output recommendations relate to the balance of the input profile? And also, I want to be clear that what I'm presenting today is descriptive, not normative. The only normative claim I'm making in today's talk is that I think you should care. We don't have the data to necessarily know what a proper balance is. We're just looking at what a proper balance should be. We're looking at what the balance is and what the recommender does with it. So how do we do all of this? We took a bunch of data sets. we got our ratings from book crossing and the Amazon reviews data, and that's how we trained our collaborative filters. That's how we analyzed user consumption profiles. We connected this to book data from Open Library and from the Library of Congress. And that gave us our book metadata, who are the authors, but neither of those data sets have information about those authors as people. So we turned to the Virtual Internet Authority file. And the Virtual Internet Authority file has author metadata. And one of the metadata flags it has for many authors is gender identity. And so we link all of these data sets together, and we get something that we can start to look at research question 1. Now, we're operationalizing our research question as what percentage of books by authors whose gender we can determine are written by female authors? And I will acknowledge here, and I'm going to talk more, that this is looking at a binary conception of gender. I'm going to talk more about what we're doing about that in the limitation when I talk a little bit later about limitations. But we see that of the known gender authors in the Library of Congress, there's about 22% by women. But when you look at what people rate, the percentage goes higher. Amazon ratings, about 30% of the rated books are by women, and in the book crossing data set, it's about 40%. So we already see that women are more represented in the rated books than they are in the book inventory as approximated by the Library of Congress. So with this data, we then ran a recommender experiment. We sampled 1,000 users that have enough data we can do statistics. We looked at their user profiles. We then generated recommendations for each user using a few different collaborative filtering algorithms, computed the recommendation list distribution, and then we finally looked at individual links between user inputs and recommendation outputs. Because users rate different numbers of books, and there's a world of difference between 2 of the 5 books you've rated being by women and 20 of the 50 books you've rated being by women, we use a hierarchical Bayesian model to allow us to pool data across our users while still inferring individual user tendencies to infer a smooth user profile balance. And then we analyze the recommendation profile balance as a linear regression in log odds space against that user input. So research question 2, how are user profiles distributed? And the answer is that they are very diffuse. The average user had a mild tendency towards male authors, but not near as strong as the underlying inventory. So we can say the average user is doing better than the inventory if our goal is to have approximately equal representation. But there's high variance. Users differed wildly in what the balance of their user profiles was. When we look at the recommendation list, the variance decreases. And they're more consistent, but there is still a fair amount of variance. The average balance is generally comparable, but the nearest neighbor methods did exhibit some shift in what that average balance is. And then for the personalized link, the regressions that we did, we've got this sea of charts, but the key takeaway is that for all of our algorithms that actually personalize, so the pure matrix factorization trained on this data, the way it was configured, it wasn't really personalizing. So analyzing it in this sense doesn't make sense, so I dropped it. But they're propagating some of the user input balance into the output recommendations. The extent to which they do that varies, but all of them are propagating some of it. And we would expect a perfect recommender to pick up on any pattern and then propagate it into the output. The question with a lot of this work is, well, our recommenders aren't perfect. And they might be imperfect in ways that we might consider socially beneficial or socially harmful. And our goal here is to map out what that response curve is. So I want to talk a little bit about the limitations. If you've worked with the book rating data, you've probably known it's a lot sparser than the publicly available movie rating data, which affects algorithm performance when you go and you train a collaborative filter. So that affects what's going on here. Our matrix factorization configuration wasn't very personalized. Also, this work as it stands right now just looks at binary gender. And there's 2 sources of that limitation. One is in the statistical model. We are currently working for the next step of this work on changing to a statistical model that is going to relax that and allow us to handle much more nuanced conceptions of gender. The other is in the data. While the MARC authority record format that the data is in is very flexible in its representation of gender identity, the actual data we have does not make use of that flexibility, so we need to get better data. We also just tested a few algorithms, but what we're trying to do here is use what we have to generate more knowledge and then improve on that as we iterate forward. So in conclusion, users exhibit mild diffuse tendency towards male authors, but this is not near as strong as the tendency of the underlying inventory. Nearest neighbor and Poisson factorization propagated some user balance to recommendations. A lot of future work we're working on. We've got several years of work planned going forward on this. Code to reproduce all of the experiments, as well as the slides, are available online, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, questions? I know you're all ready for coffee, but maybe yes, right over there.
Thanks, Michael. Are you able to see from your data whether things are improving over time?
Not yet, but adding time is one of the next things on the agenda. Well, probably about thing 3 on the agenda.
Jan, over here.
Thank you for the talk. Have you looked at any differences in genre, book genres, whether these trends may be different for different genres?
Not yet, and that's one of the things also that we're wanting to start looking at next. And this is a question that I've gotten commonly in the reviewing process of this paper, and in trying to think about what difference it makes, I think what it's going to do is it's going to give us a broader context. Rather than looking at our overall inventory as our base rate, we can look at our inventory per genre as our base rate and deal with it in that sense. But we haven't done that yet. It's on the to-do list, hopefully sometime in the next year.
Similarly, geographic differences may be very interesting. Is your data based on US data?
So this data is not geographic specific, but it's probably US focused because the Amazon data set comes from Amazon.com, and I don't think it includes any of the international properties. So I believe it does have a US focus right now, but right now we're using the data that's there and not looking specifically at any geographic limitations, but I expect
that
both
distinction in your data, you just don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. And with a half-hour coffee break in mind, where you can ask your question, I want to thank Michael once more and see you in the next session.